do for the round table. Hold your questions verbally, but put them in the chat. And what we will try to do when we have time for discussion is start with the chat things that appear there. I like to be very professorial and organize some of the questions. And then if there's time and interest, we can open the floor for more direct interaction. But it really works well on Zoom, especially with a large crowd like we seem to be having, that we do it through that kind of mechanism. Um, so, and should keep watch on chat for not only the questions, but various comments and information that will be shared. So this is a very special roundtable for us. Usually we have local presenters, but but Ben Manski is kind of a local presenter displaced to Virginia. He was a graduate student for a number of years here at UCSB, and that's part of his general life story. He's a national activist in a number of ways, and very much an activist where he started life in Madison, Wisconsin, and came to UCSB to do graduate work here in sociology. I was proud to be a mentor of his or a member of his graduate committees and work with him all those years. So many people you might have met or worked with Ben when he was here. And what happened, and some of you were present some years ago when Gar Alperovitz came from DC to give a presentation here on the same general theme that we're going to be talking about today, the Next System Project, Democracy Collaborative, part of his work. And this is a project that's been going on for a number of years with a lot of ambition, not a lot of publicity on a national level, but I'm very personally feel very identified with the spirit of it, and I think our own experience here bears relevance to it. The spirit being that locally we have resources and capacities to build up institutions that point beyond capitalism, beyond the current system, toward a more cooperative, more collective, more democratic alternatives. And we have some institutions already developed here, not just action, but institutions like our new community energy distribution entities that exist here in our region is one example.
Hey, no.
Hello? So I would like now to introduce Ben Manski. You're going to he will moderate and take over and introduce our other great speakers. Thank you all for being here, and let's interact. Ben.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dick. And I have to say that it's a real pleasure to join not only you, but everybody else in Santa Barbara and a few folks who are joining from other parts of the continent. What we discussed amongst ourselves, Joe Guinan, April Donor, Matt Nelson, and I, was having a few rounds of discussion amongst ourselves. We form a team that's at the sort of kind of a nucleus, I guess, at the center of the next phase of the Next System Project. So rather than having you all sit through 12 to 15-minute presentations, which would actually be really engaging from anybody here, we're going to do things in that way. We're going to take it in that way. And so I'm not going to say much more for a little while. I'm going to turn it over directly to my close friend and colleague, Joe Guinan, who's president of the Democracy Collaborative. And Joe is going to talk about the crises that we are facing and the relationship between the systemic crises of this moment and the broader period and next system thinking. So please welcome Joe Guinan.
Thanks so much, Ben, and a real pleasure to be with you all. I've had the privilege of visiting Santa Barbara on a number of occasions, and hope to be back again soon and working with you all on some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. So just to kind of set the scene a little bit, our colleague and and collaborator Gus Speth, who's an important figure in the environmental movement, likes to quote Abraham Lincoln to the effect that if we could first know where we are, we could better judge what to do and how to do it. And I think that's the question of the day in terms of where we are on the crisis and how do we go about responding to it. And the first thing I want to say about the crisis at the moment is that what we are facing with Trump is a government of the radical right. And I'm saying that not as an insult, but a matter of strategic analysis. I think it's important that we consider that as we develop our own strategy and response. And in this regard, the Trump administration represents a mixture of homegrown, old-fashioned American reaction, that's neo-Confederate politics plus plutocratic economics, with some new elements of a tried and tested playbook that has really been honed by the radical right in a number of countries around the world where they've taken power in recent years, as well as drawing upon some of the lessons that Trump's people have taken from his own presidential term. And the reason I say this is that I think there's a danger in how we respond to what we're seeing with Trump, with the assault by the radical right on the administrative state, in allowing ourselves to be backed into mounting a species of rearguard defense of the status quo. And I think that would be a huge error. That would fatally position us on the wrong side of some very powerful political dynamics that we see in America and in many other places around system, anti-system, and change status quo dynamics that really are in many ways defining the politics of our age. And to fall into that trap would be to allow the radical right to present themselves as change makers in a broken system rather than what they actually are, which is agents of a decaying order seeking to protect and advance a very particular set of their own material interests. And I also mention it because I think it's essential that we actually start to study analytically the radical right, not moralistically, because it's becoming very clear to me and others that they have been studying us on the left and our movements in some cases for decades. But if we take this perspective, we can see that Trump is a symptom and not a cause of the crisis, even as many of the things that Trump is doing are deepening the dynamics of crisis. And I scarcely think I even need to identify some of the aspects of the systemic crisis that we're facing at the moment. They're increasingly self-evident, certainly to many of the people on this call. We're talking about inequality, cost of living, climate breakdown, rising fascism, the collapsing faith in democracy and democratic institutions, racism, poverty, plutocracy, war. And at the bottom of it all, we at TDC would argue are the operations of our economic system. Everybody knows that the US economy is no longer working for most ordinary Americans, and indeed that it hasn't done so for a very long time. If you look at the last several presidential election cycles in America, supermajorities across gender, age, race, party affiliation, geography have regularly told pollsters that they have an unfavorable view of the economy, that they feel that the economy is rigged against them. And they're not wrong. And I'm not going to go into all the data. We could do that on some other occasion. At TDC, we publish something every 5 years we call the Index of Systemic Trends, which can be found at index.democracycollaborative.org. And this is basically a data bank of economic, social, environmental, political indicators of the health of the United States. And the basic point, the headline of all that data is this. For all the ups and downs of the political and business cycle, for most Americans, on many very important indicators of economic, social, and democratic health, there's been little improvement and in many cases, substantial deterioration over a period that's now getting on for half a century. And the one data point I'll give you is the majority of workers using BLS category of production and supervisory workers, which is 7 out of 10 American workers. The average US worker then hasn't had a real terms pay increase since the 1970s. All the gains to the system over a period of half a century have gone to the top. And there are political consequences of running a system in which all the gains go to the top for an extended period of time. It's not politically sustainable. There's inevitably a backlash. This, we would argue, is a significant aspect of the current crisis that we're facing in America. If the economy isn't working for most Americans, it has to be changed. Either that or all the problems we're facing will continue to get worse. And that's really what brings us to the conversation today about practical possibilities for political economic system change, and not just the need, but the actual practical possibility and availability of building a new system, a next system. And so the last thing I want to say is just about strategic orientation towards the moment we're in. It's really important that we don't give in to defeatism or succumb to what I think is a deliberate disorientation strategy of the radical right that Steve Bannon has termed flooding the zone, which is to hit us with so much stuff, boom, 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 all the time in order to disorient us and be able to push through the lion's share of their agenda. And it's hard amid all that to see and hear through all this pain, through the immigration raids and the executive overreach and all the things that you've been talking about at the start of this meeting. But there will be opportunities in all of this for us, for the actual left, if we play our cards right. Milton Friedman and the neoliberals said it: never let a serious crisis go to waste. And so while we lament a lot of what's happening at the moment, the loss of park rangers and oceanographers and financial regulators and all of that, the net effect of the US state on many people's lives has not been positive for a very long time. And as the assault on our painfully antique constitution and the dismantling and wrecking of the capitalist administrative state goes forward, there are no guarantees, but as a lot of this is being unceremoniously swept away, including a lot of illusions, this is going to open up possibilities for other futures if only we can bring the elements of those futures into contention, creating openings for a more democratic polity and economy. And that's where I want to stop for the moment.
Thank you so much, Joe. And we're going to come back around to some of that, and I think we're also going to come to some of it right now. So I'm going to turn to April Donor, who is a steward with the Asset-Based Community Development Institute, which is based out of Chicago, and also a fellow with both the Goldin Institute and also, I should say, trainer with the Goldin Institute and a fellow with the Democracy Collaborative. And I think you were going to talk a little bit about how communities have been responding and some of the positive developments of late, and then we'll continue to talk about that. So take it away, April.
Thank you. So of course, there are so many ways communities have been responding, right? You look at one community and it has one way. What I wanted to share a bit about was one process that I and our team have been a part of, which is a really, I think, compelling example of what's possible when we look at, how do we start to imagine but build real form around another system? And that's called the resist and build process. So this is a US-based process. It's a network that is very actively moving, bringing together a wide mix of movement organizations and networks rooted in something called the solidarity economy. And so I've been involved for the last 3 years, and our team overall has been involved since its inception in 2020. And really the idea behind resist and build is in the name, right? We can't hide from the fact that there are very bad things going on, expressions of the current system that we need to resist. But we also need to have a proposal, and we also need to be building the new. And solidarity economy, which is the kind of big tent of this process, is a global movement as well, to build the world that centers around people and planet rather than profit and growth. So really a post-capitalist proposal. And one of the things that's powerful about solidarity economy is rather than just being a kind of theoretical, abstract blueprint, it's grounded in concrete, real-world community practices that exist around us now. Many of them are old, and some are emergent innovations. So those include things like worker-owned co-ops, public banks, local mutual aid, bartering, community care, time banking, et cetera. All rooted in shared principles of solidarity, participatory democracy, equity in all of its dimensions, sustainability, and pluralism. So what we've seen, through the development of this process, there are many really important and key organizations that are working both in the resist sphere and the build sphere, including the New Economy Coalition, Democracy Collaborative, GMU Next System Studies, US Solidarity Economy, regional networks around solidarity economy, just to name a few. And what we've seen is that over the years, there has been an incredible amount of resource sharing, collaboration building, and really sharpening of our collective lens around what does it mean to resist in this moment, and what does it mean to build, and how can we hold both at the same time. Most recently, we were able to convene over 300 people in Atlanta in May. And that was people both from around the country, as well as a large participation in centering the actual activists and visionaries hard at work in Atlanta, to really sit down and grapple with this moment, and, break out and identify, what are we really dealing with here, right? What are we dealing with the Crop City? What are we dealing with the crackdown, and the oppression on immigrant communities? And then also, what does it look like to do political education to bridge the resist world and the build world? Really deal with survival while we're also looking at, what is a possibility that we want to live into. And so that was a 5-day event. We were able to have many of these organizations who just are often so busy, right, doing our own work, really get together and say, what are our shared assets? How do we build this greater coordination and collaboration? That was really one of the biggest takeaways. We're doing it now and we need to continue doing it. And that yielded also new formations, strengthening of existing formations within the process, including focus on political education, narrative, media work. How do we map out and weave together all of these different expressions and understand that we are all moving towards the same goal? We're also able to raise and channel $74,000 into local Atlanta small businesses, and $44,000 to solidarity economy and movement organizations through the initiative. So really just zooming out, it's an example of, it is possible to build this next system. A lot of the work is, learning each other's shared language and recognizing that, this work goes by many names, but the work is already happening on the ground. So I will turn it back to you, Ben.
Thank you. That was great. And, in fact, April and I are both here in Montreal. We're in different buildings right now. So if you hear a little bit of background noise, it's because there's a gathering of academics and other scholars called the Society for the Advancement of Socioeconomics. So what April was just saying about sort of many different sets of networks and processes through which all the real world next system initiatives, basically initiatives to build the next system here and now, a different politics and economy and set of community practices, they're coming together in many different kinds of places. And it's just been amazing to see all the people from around the world here in Quebec. That's where we are. And also to see the example of the social solidarity economy here in Quebec, which is probably definitely the most advanced social solidarity economy movement and set of practices in the Americas. So so I just what you were saying really resonated with me. You spoke, April, to the sense of urgency of this moment and the deepening urgency that we wake up with every day, and that people in Santa Barbara County dealing with the attack on the community of Carpinteria have been dealing with. And so I want to turn it over to another old friend, actually a much older friend going back to the 90s, Matt Nelson, who is executive director of Presente.org and also a member of sort of this core group that's building for the next phase of the Next System project, to talk about that. So Matt.
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much. I love Santa Barbara. You have amazing butterflies over there that migrate, showing us that in a next system, migration actually can and should be beautiful, and it should be a fundamental human right. And so thank you to Santa Barbara. My name is Matt Nelson. I was born in Colombia. I grew up in Minnesota, which makes me a proud Minnesolombian. I would love to share with you our super secret strategic plan that I'm going to put in the chat. And yes, this is our master plan. May we be worthy of desperate hope. And you can read the rest of the quote, but that is in fact, I'm both kidding and not kidding that this is the plan. This is what we need to do. So yeah, there's a lot of things. I'm glad that we're talking about the urgency of the moment. And as someone who there's many incidences, but one I remember is that I used to run a coffee shop in Milwaukee, and the local police department, came after hours. They came banging on our door and demanded that I give them my social security number, or they would bust through the glass. This happened to be a pilot program that was, in Milwaukee to basically by the police department to threaten residents. Lucky for me, we had great neighborhood and community support who came out and who basically, held vigil to make sure that they wouldn't, smash and grab the place. But this is something that has been growing. I think what we're seeing in areas like Southern California and around the country is sort of a next system of sorts. It is not the next system that we want or that we created, but it is that. And given that the budget bill has passed, we're going to experience new levels of militarization at the border and militarization in different places. And the agenda is border everywhere. And that is that's the goal, is for neighbors to be turning in other neighbors, is for law enforcement to be agents of this agenda, and for it to be heavily surveilled, heavily militarized, for employers to be turning against their staff, for employees to be turning against each other. And the remedy to a border everywhere is sanctuary. And sanctuary is something that, of course, has its roots both in the 1980s in terms of transnational connection, particularly in Central America and the United States, but also roots going back to abolition, roots going back to providing sanctuary for those who were escaping slavery. And so it's that legacy that I think we need today. And the thing about sanctuary everywhere is you can literally create it everywhere. There are now people who are signing up to accompany people going to work, to watch over shifts in agriculture and in the trades. And it's something that I think is universalizing. And just an idea of being part of a modern day sanctuary movement, I think, is what is called for. Now, I did want to connect some of the dots here around what I think is a deepening crisis around militarization, privatization, and this sort of dehumanizing attack on immigrants and migrants in particular. Not just the narrative aspect of it, but there is, about 10 years ago, the private prison industry was near collapse. They were about to basically not be able to function. There were some serious threats to their funding and to their status of real estate investments, to their properties. But now they've been able to make claims that are being heard, that they actually want to be a legitimate arm of the government. They want the full authority of the federal government and law enforcement to be able to expand things like we see in Florida, which isn't, which is the model. And what that model is also a convergence of really horrible agendas related to immigration, which was, and if people recall, in 2006, there was actually a debate within the right around, one side represented by Congress member Sensenbrenner, who believed in a very brutal white supremacist agenda, essentially round everybody up and deport everybody brutally. And then there was the other side of it, which was George W. Bush, who just wanted labor exploitation, who wanted a corporatized, privatized agenda. But they were fighting each other. Now we're at a time where I believe those two sides have come together in what we see now. It is both the most brutal of a corporate privatization agenda, essentially giving blank checks to the worst private prison companies and some of the worst companies that ever existed. And there is a violent violent, xenophobic, white supremacist agenda that's fueling this both narrative. And so I do think that what we can learn is that sanctuary is, we need to build institutions of sanctuary, and that has to be local, that has to be national, and I think that's the way that we get out of this. So happy to talk more about it. I think I'll pause there for now, but I'm glad to be in community with everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much, Matt. And yeah, we are going to turn to some specific place-based cases in a moment. And I think that was a really good opening framing from the three of you. And I'm going to add a little bit that has to do with my own focus and areas of work that I think are relevant to people in Santa Barbara and frankly elsewhere in a moment. So we're sort of coming at this from the broad big picture. And I appreciate very much the description of the next system that is already being implemented from the systemic movement from above that is working through the federal government to impose a next system on all of us that most people don't want and that we are increasingly resisting. And then, as you describe, an alternative next system that involves, in part, sanctuary everywhere. No human is illegal. And I want to talk about another part of that next system. I was in Santa Barbara for 7 years. My 3 boys were born there because, as Dick Flax mentioned, I was pursuing a PhD in sociology pretty late in life. And I am now a tenure track professor at the largest public university in Virginia, which is George Mason University. And as some of you may have also read this morning, we are under attack in a pretty profound way. There was a Department of Justice complaint filed last week claiming a pervasive climate of anti-Semitism, which I and 75 other Jewish faculty members have condemned that complaint, that investigation that has been launched against us in our university, calling it out as completely false and perpetrated by an administration that is filled with Nazis and Nazi sympathizers. Then on Wednesday, a second investigation was launched against our president, basically a full attack on affirmative action, aka DEI, in the history of affirmative action at this university, in which the majority of faculty are still white, but the majority of our students are much more representative of our communities, the majority students of color, majority first-generation college students. So we're in the middle of that. I just wanted to speak to that because it's very much on my mind right now. But George Mason University has also been at the center of building an international network of scholars within academia, faculty, graduate students, undergrads, staff, and alumna who are building what we are calling Next System Studies. We both have a Next System Studies program at George Mason University. I provided a link in the chat, and you can certainly find that. Just Google or look for Next System Studies and GMU, and you'll find it. We are now going into our 5th year of that program. Beyond that, we also have been working with people internationally to build this field we're called Next System Studies, which is a field that crosses all the disciplines. I mean, we have physicists coming to us and saying, how can we work with you, sociologists, legal scholars, people from the humanities, from environmental studies, from the fine arts, who are involved in building this field of fields, as we call it. And the field of fields involves the study of system crises, systemic movements, which is to say movements that are working to change the system, next system design, both the design of the current system and also alternative next system designs, and system change. How do we get there? How does one system become another system? So this is a real field with a theory of the field and epistemologies and methodologies and so on that we've been building. I'd say there are 2 major directions that we're going with this field building process right now. One, I want to make this invitation to everybody here, and this may be reversed. No, it looks like it's showing up okay on your screens. I want to invite you to take part in the Next System teach-ins. And I think it would be really great for Santa Barbara to organize a teach-in in this next round of teach-ins. That's coming up November 1st through the 16th. And basically, for those of you who are around, and I've heard from a few of you in the chat about this, that you were around for the Next System teach-ins, this pilot round in 2016, you have a sense of this. A teach-in is an event that involves so many people that it becomes impossible to be at that university or campus or in the community and not know at least that it happens. So it's a really an attempt to teach in, to bring people in and to engage in a pivotal question of the moment. So the moratorium on Vietnam and the teachings of the late 1960s were teachings that took on the question of the Vietnam War and what are we going to do about it as a campus community and as a community. The teach-in that was known as Earth Day, the largest teach-ins in world history, produced the second wave environmental movement. You had the teach-ins on apartheid in South Africa in the 1980s. You had teach-ins on corporate power and education called the democracy teach-ins in the 1990s. So the next system teach-ins are another round of teach-ins taking on the question of system change, what kind of system we want, how do we get there, what do we know about it, who can we learn from, and what does this have to do with the crises of the time. So the long and the short of it is, if there's going to be a teach-in in Mexico City, there should be a teach-in in Santa Barbara. If there's going to be a teach-in in Glasgow, there should be a teach-in in Santa Barbara. So I want to urge you to get involved with that. And then the other thing I just want to say is that in addition to having this kind of broad framework around next system studies, and for anybody who is involved with higher ed, I can send you my syllabus. I'm happy to talk with any of you about what it looks like at a university or a college or even a high school. But we are also moving in a strategic direction around what we're calling a uni-muni community strategy. And the idea here is that we need to get much more explicit and aggressive about a set of practices that have a long history, which is of people in universities working very closely with people in local government in forms of radical governance, and people at the community level and community neighborhood associations, community organizations, and cooperatives and independent businesses around moving much faster to build the kind of culture of solidarity that Matt Nelson was describing in Milwaukee, which is a wonderful city if you haven't had a chance to visit with community members there. And I also think in Chicago, I know you're going to be speaking to Chicago in a moment, April, but we can see it in many places where that's already happening. And I think that's a big part of the next system is building very dense, solidaristic regions around the world that are prepared to link together and provide an alternative to a world system that is in stages of collapse. So that's where I'm going to leave things, and I'm going to turn it back to Joe and then April and Matt and myself to give some specific place-based examples so you get a sense of some of the things that are happening in different regions of the world. We could speak about many others, but I'm going to turn it over to Joe Guinan.
Thanks, Ben. And I know there's some conversation about the nature of the crisis, and maybe we're going to get to that in some of the discussion later. But where I want to go next is practice and what we're actually doing practically to respond to this crisis and the levels of institutional development and change that are already underway that begin to point towards the contours of a possible, practicable, realizable, and desirable next system. So 25 years ago, when the Democracy Collaborative was formed by Gar Alperovitz and Ted Howard, what we were setting about was the work of political economic system change. We started from the premise that what needed to change was the fundamental operations, institutions, relationships, and outcomes of the economy that's laid out in great detail in that index work that I talked about earlier. It was our belief that we should no longer be working on the basis of what might be called social democratic or liberal redistributive strategies, right? Which really seek to allow capitalism to produce growth and then tries to clean up around the edges with regulation and redistributive social spending after the fact. We saw that as essentially working against the fundamental dynamics of this economy, whose structural workings increasingly make that difficult, if not impossible, like trying to climb up an ever faster moving downward escalator. And it's those institutional arrangements at the heart of today's capitalism: private corporate ownership, credit creation by banks, global capital markets, giant publicly traded corporations that are together the engine that is pushing the extraction of value and its concentration upwards, which is very clearly what is happening if you look at the data. And so it's this basic set of relationships, this basic institutional design that's driving the outcomes we're seeing in terms of crumbling public infrastructure, social atomization, uneven development, environmental destruction, popular disempowerment, and on and on. And so if we're serious about addressing the core economic challenges, we need a different set of institutions a different set of core economic arrangements capable of producing sustainable, lasting, and more democratic outcomes. A new paradigm, if you like, a democratic economy in support of a democratic polity. And what we found when we looked around was that the elements of this new direction are already emerging. They're a response to pain and crisis, a series of powerful new institutional approaches and models. We talked about them at the outset: state-owned banks, municipally owned utilities, worker-owned firms, community-owned solar, and many, many more practical efforts that are rooted in new forms of collective ownership and core ownership of the economy that have at the heart of them this value of community. And these institutional designs, we begin to argue and put forward, prefigure some of the fundamentals of a next system that is democratic, community sustaining, and that operates within planetary boundaries and allows everyone to thrive. And what we did was pull together a strategy to build more of those that we called community wealth building, which was our attempt to begin to stitch them together in a strategy of economic transformation of local and regional economies from the bottom up. And where we started, the very first self-conscious model of community wealth building was in Cleveland, Ohio, with the Evergreen Cooperatives. Cleveland had lost a lot of its population, most of its Fortune 500 companies, due to deindustrialization, disinvestment, capital flight. But when we looked at the nature of the economy that was still there, it still had very large nonprofit and quasi-public institutions. I'm talking about the Cleveland Clinic, Case Western Reserve University, university hospitals, what we and others have been calling anchor institutions, because they're actually rooted in their place and they aren't likely to up and leave like a lot of private corporations. And together, these institutions, themselves largely dependent on flows of public funds, on favorable tax treatment, are spending billions and billions of dollars each year, very little of which back then was going into the local community. And so what we did was work with those anchor institutions, with the city of Cleveland and with the Cleveland Foundation, to pursue a strategy to localize their procurement spending in support of a network of purposely created businesses, green worker co-ops that were tied together in a community corporation. These included a large industrial scale ecologically advanced laundry, an urban greenhouse, a renewable energy company. We've since added a fund that allows us to pursue employee ownership conversions of existing businesses. And in each of these worker co-ops, a golden share is retained by a community corporation, which sits on top of them and makes sure that they can't be sold unless it's in the interests of the enterprise and the community as a whole. And unlike conventional corporations, of course, these democratically owned businesses aren't going to pick up and move their jobs to another location. We're also finding that they have very strong interests in the wider development of the neighborhood around them, of improving the literacy of their workforce, so that they can make better decisions as part of the collective governance of the firm and so on. And through this, you can begin to see the beginnings of the buildings of democratic economic citizenship on the ground level of the economy. And today, the Evergreen companies have grown. They're profitable. They're competing with the multinational corporations that had previously been providing contract services to those big anchor institutions. Evergreen is owned by its employees, the vast majority of whom are Black, many of whom are returning citizens, most of whom live in the nearby historically underserved and under-resourced neighborhoods. And Evergreen's now the second largest minority-owned business in Northeast Ohio. It recently beat out the multinational corporation Sodexo to secure the full laundry contract for the Cleveland Clinic. They then took over the existing Sodexo plant, rehired all of Sodexo's former employees on a living wage, offered them a fast track to employee ownership. No jobs were lost. The only thing that disappeared was the dividends that were going to Sodexo's absentee shareholders, which is, of course, the source of the financial extraction that is at the fundamental heart of what's going wrong with our economy. That's the original model of community wealth building. It's since spread far and wide to Europe, to Britain, Ireland, Scotland. We're now active in South Korea, in Australia, in Poland, and of course, we're busy bringing back versions of community wealth building in partnership with organizations working on the ground in many US cities, from Atlanta and St. Louis to Denver, and most recently conversations right next door to me here in Washington, D.C. with Prince George's County in Maryland. Ben, back to you.
Excellent. And there's many resources about everything that Joe just shared and much more that are available to you on community wealth building at the Democracy Collaborative. And there are networks of practitioners and scholars working on community wealth building in different parts of the world. So just want to let you know that there's much more where this came from. And to give you sort of an on the ground, sort of perspective on sort of a set of place-based practices that do involve community wealth building, but also some other practices. I'm going to go to April Donor, who's located in Little Village in Chicago, on Chicago's west side most of the time.
Thanks, Ben. So, we really wanted to highlight Chicago today as one example of where we're really seeing, advancement in these ideas coming together through real institutional investment, that many of them are still emergent, but there's a lot of, coordination that is growing within the city. And speaking, of course, of the ICE raids and the attacks on our migrant neighbors, across the country and on communities, it is interesting that, the federal government certainly tried at first to wage some attacks on Chicago, and we've seen a lot of resistance, and it might be an indicator, right, that there's enough strength and capacity that's been built here, that they chose to, not actually focus as much on Chicago. So, that's one possible hopeful sign for our city. So just a few things that really stand out in Chicago. One is the Chicago Teachers Union. Has really been leading the way for years as a forward-thinking union that's committed to social justice, a more democratic and community-controlled economy. They hosted the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives. Major thing in terms of many historical unions kind of having some skepticism or pushback against ideas of worker ownership and related approaches. So they're really stepping forward in that. They work actively with other unions, electrical workers, the nurses, and communications unions. They've really stood up. I've received messages from the union regarding their protection of our schools. My daughter goes to school in a heavily Latino community in our neighborhood, and they made very clear that there will be no ICE agents allowed into the schools. Also been engaged in bargaining for the common good, so creating green climate targets for schools, and also involved in climate issues in other ways. They have Environmental Justice Freedom School that they've sponsored for young people in the city. So that's one major institution that is operating and having quite an impact in the city. Another is the Community Wealth Building Initiative that was sponsored by the City of Chicago and really carried forward through the University of Illinois Chicago, UIC. And this was a $15 million investment that then went on to leverage additional funding overall over 3 years. And also speaking of the Uni-Muni community strategy that we really highlight in Next System, this is a wonderful example of that, of really building, leveraging the strength of these institutions and also working with community. So they're focused over these 3 years, and TDC was also involved in the development of this initiative. Was to really strengthen the ecosystem of these new expressions of a democratic economy, of community-controlled economy, to build the pipeline. So, many of these small iterations are often get stuck right at the grassroots level. So, really building strength to get them to the next stage of their development, and then also surfacing new pilot projects that could come into shape through focus. And it was, incredibly successful. I will share a link to, you can read the report here, and really carry the city forward in terms of community wealth building, Next System, right, as one expression of Next System. Some of the projects that they funded included a grocery store initiative, worker co-ops that were able to develop further, limited equity housing cooperatives, community land trusts, and community investment vehicles that can make the rest of these things possible. I also really want to highlight, particularly close to my heart, Chicago is the quiet and proud home. Another one of these movements that you don't see in the news as much, but has been really steadily influential over the last 30 years, called the Asset-Based Community Development, also known as ABCD. So Chicago was the hub from which ABCD was launched back in the 1990s through John McKnight and Jody Kretzmann. That's been my background for many years. So really the focus of ABCD is how do we really build community strength and leadership and self-determination, drawing on the existing skills, talents, and leaderships within neighborhoods. And that covers economy as well as all kinds of things in ways that community members themselves really have the capacity to solve incredibly complex problems, but are often kind of usurped and sidelined by organizations that don't really recognize those capacities. So the work of ABCD is about kind of retooling neighbors and citizens, and I don't mean that in a legal sense, to take control of their futures and their communities and kind of rediscover their relationships with each other of care and collaboration. So we are the home of the ABCD Institute, which has been, the launching of the movement, and then also has been growing as more of a network globally and in the US to connect practitioners and deepen folks' practice of ABCD. And that has had ripple effects into numerous fields that go beyond economy or community, into the health fields, into education, in ways that we're not even able to measure. And also home to the Goldin Institute, where I'm privileged to work. And that has been working since 2018 to work very deeply and closely with grassroots activists in the west and south sides of Chicago, inspiring them, equipping them with the tools and these practices, strengthening their own practices and highlighting those and connecting them with each other. And their work has been rippling out across the city and globally in many ways that are beginning to be recognized more and more, the kinds of innovations that they are creating, and also the solidarity that they found with each other and with the different relationships that they've been able to build through the program has been really quite impressive. So yeah, I'll pass it back to you, Ben.
Okay, yeah, and I'll just say, as Dick Flax mentioned earlier, I spent most of my life in Wisconsin, 28 years there, and many other places as well, but I'm very much a Wisconsinite. So anybody who's familiar with the relationship between Wisconsin and Illinois and Chicago is aware that it hurts a Wisconsinite to praise Illinois. But I have been around Chicago for a long time. I spent a lot of time in Chicago in the late 80s and throughout the 90s. And Chicago, from my perspective, and I travel a lot and I interact with people all over the world, it really is a leader right now and will be for a while. It's just amazing how much that city has turned around. You can see it on the streets, you can see it in communities and meetings, you can see it in terms of all the innovations, you can see it in terms of the leadership that city has been providing. Some of you may be aware that the largest round, and some of that is very much at the community level and the kinds of things that April was talking about, but I also want to say politically in terms of resistance, as part of the rounds of protests over this past year, we had International Workers' Day with protests in at least 1,800 communities across the country. And that came out of Chicago, which of course is the historic home of International Workers' Day in the late 19th century. So that's why I'm paying attention to Chicago. I'm drawing attention to it because I think it's worthy of it. I'm going to turn it over to Matt, and then I'm going to say a little bit about what we're doing at the local level in Northern Virginia. And then I think maybe we just open it up and I'll turn it back to you, Dick. And the rest of us on the panel, we can talk about sort of that last question of how we knit these things together as we're engaged in discussion with others. So let's go to Matt Nelson. Thank you so much, April.
Great, and thank you. One thing I want to talk about, which is both translocal and national, is, a couple of weeks ago we relaunched an effort that we're calling Solidarity Restaurants, and that is, it's an effort to basically, to connect the ecosystem of restaurants. And everybody sort of has their favorite restaurant. Restaurants are in many ways sort of an interesting version of anchor institutions. Some of our most precious moments, birthday parties, engagements, very special moments happen at restaurants. Oftentimes, it's these local restaurants that people see the same folks every day. We know each other. They're inherent community building spaces, and they're also under attack. Under attack at a moment where they're really struggling to rebuild from COVID. So we see this Now, maybe we should wait for the person to mute or
I'm
something.
sorry, what?
I'm wondering if whoever is
Oh,
administering
you're on
could
your
please,
walk?
if somebody could just mute them for us, that would be great.
What?
Whoever has the ability to do that.
Margaret Connell.
I think it's
Yeah.
Margaret Connell, if you can mute her.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Awesome.
Beautiful. Sorry, Matt.
So
Right.
these are the model is both for again in this model of sanctuary for all and the practice of solidarity, and it's a model that I think what we've seen when we launched it even transcends politics, as restaurants do. Most restaurants are places where welcomes a variety of people, a diversity of views, but it's a place where we can really talk about what's going on in local communities at a deep level, and at the end of the day come together around a set of values, connecting values of taking care of each other, and that really relate to the values of why people start and maintain and support and really put so much blood, sweat, and tears into local business. And so this is a project that is replicable across the country, and that is something that we can build different sites of connection, of community, of solidarity, and of organizing. And it also is something that the people who own the restaurants are participating in, making sure that they are providing know your rights information and connecting with the legal teams that we have available. It's to make sure the staff knows what their rights are, and what to look out for in terms of a climate of ever increasing suppression rates, and also just to engage the customers, to engage people who really care about these restaurants into a community beyond just like your favorite place to go for coffee or lunch. And so it's this type of what I would call like social movement infrastructure that I think we need more of in order to create this climate of sanctuary for all through a deepening practice of solidarity.
Thank you, Matt. And so we can sort of get a sense in terms of place. We can be talking about very, very localized places. We can be talking about neighborhoods. We're talking about a business or people around the business. We can be talking about municipalities and regions. And so I want to certainly encourage people to get involved with sanctuary restaurants and to pass that on to others who should know about it. But also, it just reminds me of just how many examples there are. I mean, I have a mental map, and I know others here do as well. We can go through, sweep across the country from the Pacific coast to the East Coast, and spend a lot of time in the Midwest and the South along the way. And there are these kinds of initiatives happening everywhere. So it's a powerful moment. We have a lot more knowledge, I would argue, than we might have had in the past about what a next system can look like. Speaking of knowledge, I'm going to put in the chat here a link to a project called Democratizing Nova. Nova is Northern Virginia. So this is the 3 major counties of Northern Virginia, the cities of, and then Arlington and Alexandria. And then for us, we're reaching out even beyond these counties that are actually the population centers of our region. My county, Fairfax County, has over 2 million people. So it's much larger than Washington, D.C., much more diverse racially than Washington, D.C. And there are all kinds of things happening in my county and the surrounding counties. And what we've been doing is been engaging in a very long-term project of building the capacity for our region to build a next system over the next 10 to 20 years. And so that's been, first, a process of inquiry as a project that started out at our university. So we've gone out and built a database of democratizing initiatives in 16 different categories of life, from everything from community ownership of land and media to practices by indigenous communities and now federally recognized tribes to engage in a climate transition, a just transition using tribal authority. It's a very sort of inclusive set of categories. And we found over 160 live initiatives in Northern Virginia that meet our selection criteria. So this is a research project. And then out of that, we built relationships and we brought people together. So we've had 2 in-person summits, DNOVA summits, that have been really wonderful. And then out of that, we've built a governance structure. So we now have a council that brings together organized labor, independent business, worker cooperatives, community organizations, faith communities, universities. And it's really, there's actually a lot of activity now. There are new things coming out of this. So I'm just putting this forward as a kind of model for people who are engaged in higher education, or for those of you who have relationships to higher education, to look at universities perhaps not simply as allies or places that have resources, but as institutions from which a project of social reconstruction can emerge. And I'll wrap with this. I did grow up in Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, we have this thing called the Wisconsin idea. The Wisconsin idea is that the borders of the university are the boundaries of the state, that the job of the University of Wisconsin system is to stand with ordinary people, with working people, to build the capacity for self-governance across the state. And from that idea, we got social security, we got public radio, we got community-supported agriculture. I mean, there's so many things that have come out of that. So I am fully embracing that. That's really what Next System Studies at GMU is about. And I want to offer that as one approach to building this kind of place-based, deep reconstruction project that I think offers real hope in this desperate time. And I want to turn it back to you, Dick, at this point. I really look forward to the discussion with everybody.
Well, thanks. And there's one point being made in the chat by John Mulkins, who I don't think I know. I can frame it this way. This local approach starting locally, in my mind, is in part a strategic reaction to the difficulty of transforming systems on a national or global level. But what can we accomplish locally? And that's the whole argument of the Next Systems project, is that much can be accomplished both in actual change and in models of change. But the question being raised in the chat is, how far can this go without a democratization of the American Constitution itself? And I know, Ben, you're an expert on constitutional issues as well as what we've been talking about here. So maybe you want to comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And John, I apologize. I know I'm way overdue for a conversation, and I appreciate all the work you've been doing with the podcasting. And it's really promising that I'm seeing signs of people with skills and a lot of sort of great insights who are coming forward in terms of taking on the question of constitutional change. So I want to also help to link up because I'm at a point where I'm not able to follow up with a lot of the opportunities to help people cross paths. So on the question of constitutionalism, I am, as a couple of people have said, as Dick said, and Abel said in the chat, this is my central empirical research. I'm working on a book on constitutional revolutions. And the reason why I'm so focused on constitutionalism is that I see in the engagement in constitutional change on the part of democracy movements the capacity to do exactly what you spoke to, John, which is to bring together a very broad coalition and to help that coalition to articulate a vision for a next system. That's what constitutions do. They allow ordinary people to see together in written word a next order, a different kind of way of governing ourselves. And that's why any kind of written constitution is actually threatening to authoritarianism. Even in societies that are heavily authoritarian, I found in my research, the process of constitutional change, even when it's top down, undermines their authority in the long run. And so I think that the question of constitutional change within the United States is a critical one, but it's also a question that has to be taken up at the municipal level. So there's a international municipalist movement that sometimes goes under the name Fearless Cities that is networked led by the people of Barcelona and Catalonia. That represents constitutionalism too, this kind of local constitutionalism where people are redefining the way they govern themselves locally. There are other forms, digital constitutionalism, so getting people together to write the code for the digital society. That's something that we're working on, and it is one approach. So if we have these place-based approaches, right, that are about building a different political, economic, and ecological system on a regional basis, the constitutional approaches can help to bring them together, because after all, it is a world system. We share one planet. It is bounded, and we have to find ways to govern ourselves collectively across the planet. So I agree with you.
And I think however, what we've learned, even apart from the specific question that was raised by John Mulkins, is how shaky our assumptions have been even about the existing Constitution and protecting majority rule. I mean, we have a situation right now where the majority of people on many indications are not in favor of most of what is being done by the national administration, and yet they are carrying this forward with many, many violations of the Constitution and of law, and we don't seem to be. We're learning about the weaknesses there, and maybe that's makes even more urgent the kind of question that John Mulkins is raising. I did want to. I think one of the virtues of next systems model thinking is to get you to think. Gets me to think about what's happening locally, what is going on locally that fits or can be related to this model. And I wanted to call your folks' attention to several examples, just because I think they really point to actions that we can be involved in right away. One is a situation in Isla Vista, the Isla Vista Food Co-op, which was established, I think, I'm scared to say 50 years ago, is in financial trouble in Isla Vista. And yet it's not just preserving the co-op that's important. Much of the future of Isla Vista depends on people getting out of the use of their private cars and into bike riding and transit, and doing something about the overload of cars. Well, part of the reason people need cars is to go buy their food and other shopping in malls, not in Isla Vista, but elsewhere in the region. And the food co-op serves as an alternative, immediate, walkable way to get a lot of people's provisions, and yet it's in trouble. And you may know, some of you, that the food co-op purchased Cantwell's, which is a small food market here in Santa Barbara. So we have just here the co-op is one of the prime social models that are the foundation of next system thinking. There is a long tradition of co-ops in this country, and including food co-ops of this kind. So people might want to look into, and maybe we could even have some future roundtable about the food co-op story and how we might be able to help that. I think they're trying to raise money right now. A more positive example in terms of progress is the establishment in the city of Santa Barbara of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and the significant victory that several of our organizations in the Housing Advocacy Network achieved of getting that funded at a level. Actually, the council has agreed to a $10 million funding of that trust fund for the coming 2 years. And that's an important financial base for the development of nonprofit housing by the Housing Authority in the city, as well as some of the other housing nonprofits that might be able to take advantage of this. That fund should be, and can be expanded in many different ways to have even more financial base. For example, foundations don't make could make donations to it. There could be a a citywide or a region-wide drive to have citizen donations for affordable housing. You could have employers contributing to the trust fund. So the establishment of this trust fund in the city is one step, and we need similar mechanisms countywide to building alternative housing and the financing of housing operating through public support as well as through the normal financial means of support. And housing is a very good example, at least locally, it may be statewide, of how the shortage of social housing in America makes what's one of the many ways we are sadly different from most of the other advanced industrial countries. It's assumed in other places that housing is a right, not just a commodity. That conception is in people's minds in this country, but not in law or in practice. And the social housing idea is simply that housing is a human need that should be built because humans need it, not simply because as a commodity for profit making and profit taking. And yet that's what housing largely is and continues to be the center of policy. So those are two examples that I'm aware of local forms of economic activity that are not bound by the typical traditional capitalist market mechanisms. And there's nothing that alien to American history by either of these examples at all. But they're underrepresented in the policies of the country at this point. So I don't know that there's other, I'm checking the chat right now just to see if there's other things we can, maybe John Mullins, you want to say more based on what you were so concerned about? Are you there? John Mulkins? Okay, any other questions or examples that people can come to mind? You can
Sorry,
raise-
I
Go ahead.
actually took me a minute. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah, no, I just I work on this. I've been working on this subject for over 10 years now, and have had that podcast to kind of delve into our Constitution and the need to change it, to democratize it, because right now we have essentially a system of minority rule, and that's not going to change until we get rid of this Constitution. And I think when we have a discussion about policies and developing new institutions and, new types of communities, that's wonderful, but it's going to be within the context of a Constitution that is largely protecting a small group of people. And that's always going to be a tremendous disadvantage. And by the way, developing a new Constitution in the United States should be considered our heritage. This is what the framers did. They presented an example to the world in 1787 about, how can we do this peacefully? Well, we go into a convention, we have a discussion, we think about it, we set it up for a vote, and if the people agree, we have a new system. And this is what we really need, is we need a democratic constitution for the United States. And as the world is descending into autocracy along with the United States, the most powerful response that we could have is to organize ourselves to thoughtfully and peacefully create a constitution that actually empowers the majority to rule. We don't have that.
right.
So as long as we all know that, I'm fine. But I think a discussion without that as an integral part of the conversation is sort of self-defeating.
Okay,
almost.
well, very thank you. Let's have other. So Harold Hill, if you're there, I wonder if you want to. I mentioned at the outset, but you didn't necessarily hear it. Your interest in the public bank issue, and that's a live issue in the state, is it not? Harold, can you Are you there?
Can you hear me,
Yeah.
Ben? Okay. Well, it's still an issue that is being tested in San Francisco and Los Angeles. It is also being tested as a statewide public bank. So, that's still in the efforts of the progressives in the state. I had a question for Ben. I was a part of the nextsystem.org activities, and they even, a few years ago had a conference at UCSB.
Yes.
And it seems like what Ben is doing should be coordinated with Gar Perovics and the Next System organization. Ben, can you comment on that?
Yeah, I may actually turn it over to Joe in a second. So it's not just coordinated, this is a direct outgrowth of Gar's work. And so Joe and Guinan and I both live in the DC area, and we go and visit Gar as much as we can for dinner. Gar is in his late 80s at this point and is not doing as much public work as he had been. But this is very much a direct carrying on of his legacy. And so when I mentioned earlier that there is a sort of a next phase of the Next System project that we are working to build, that's what I was referencing. And I'm wondering, Joe, if you could speak to that directly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, GAR's been a very important generative source of a lot of the ideas and thinking and theory of change that we're working from, and also hopefully adding to and further developing. I was very privileged to be GAR's research assistant for 4 years back in the early 2000s when he was working on America Beyond Capitalism. So I used to work out of his attic in his house, and I think it was probably one of the best political economy training programs in the world. It's just not very efficient in terms of you only get one or two at once, but there's a whole bunch of us that have been through that program, and many of whom are still associated with the collaborative. And so a couple of years ago, with Gar not as active these days, and Ted Howard, who co-founded the collaborative with Gar, stepping down, that was when myself and Stephanie McHenry stepped forward to take over the collaborative. But I've been with TDC on and off for the last 2 decades now, and was part of the design. I was the ED that was brought in to launch the Next System project in its first phase, and that really ran from 2015 until about 2020, 2021. And now what we're really looking at is, as the crisis has deepened and as we need more and more to be getting to the answers and giving people things to do, we're looking at doing a relaunch of the Next System project towards the end of this year, early next year, with a big milestone between now and then being the teach-ins that Ben has mentioned, the Next System teach-ins that we did a wave of them back in, what was it, 2016? And so there are even bigger plans afoot for rolling that out now. The Next System project kind of had two purposes. One was to raise the systemic nature of the crisis, and the second being to point to all the work that has already been done and that needed to be done around systemic design, as Ben had called it earlier, the design of alternatives. And these days, we don't need to talk about the crisis. Even our friend in the chat earlier is not denying that we're in crisis. It's just the communists and the socialists that are to blame, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's actually a much better conversation to be having, because that's starting from the recognition, a reality-based recognition that things are so bad now for so many people that the system change is coming, whether we like it or not. And what we're facing, actually, as we talked about a little bit earlier, is in some ways an attempt at system change from the right. We need to get ourselves into contention with some better, more democratic forms of system change, which include constitutional change, and build all the way up to that, and also have ways of giving people what I think, if you look at earlier constitutional moments, might be called an economic place to stand. Think of the Jeffersonian small farmer or whatever. What is the place to stand in the economy for many people in relation to the way in which they're governed? And increasingly, it's as unequal and disempowered gig workers in insecure and precarious work with less and less trade union representation as a share of the workforce as a whole to protect them and so on. So part of what we're looking at with these new institutions is a new set of places, which include the expansion of trade unionism into different areas. And there's some great work being done by labor unions in the United States at the moment that we see as very much part of this work. But one last thing I'll say is I think when we go from the big crisis picture and we immediately get into the details of the what you can do with the Isla Vista co-op, sometimes people get a little lost in the middle. What's the connection between one and the other? Well, actually, if you look at the scale of the activity that's already taking place that we can build on, 1 in 3 Americans is in a co-op already, right? 100 million are in credit unions. Add them all up, they're one of the biggest banks on Wall Street. They would knock Goldman Sachs out of the top 5, right? There's more people that are worker owners in whole or in part in their companies than are members of unions in the private sector, right? 1/4 of America's power, electricity, is already generated by co-ops or municipal utilities. These are not small-scale developments, and yet we haven't developed the politics and the political education and the political economic power of this emerging new economy. And that's part of the work of what Ben was describing as the system change piece of the puzzle, which is really how do the movements connect to the institutions and the designs to bring about the change.
That's really an important thing you just said, to recognize the degree to which institutions of the kind that we're talking about are integral to our way of life. And one example of people being completely unaware of that is the new, recently established community choice energy or electric utility process that we have in this county and in many other counties now in California. Public entities that are distributing renewable energy in putting themselves in between the electric utilities and the consumers, and we're part of that. But most people don't know it and there hasn't been much awareness at all of what the potential for growth of that kind of operation can be down the line, and what kind of benefits can come from having that kind of community-owned energy distribution, not only in terms of getting renewables, but actually in rewarding electric vehicle acquisition by people, electric appliance acquisition, and stuff like that. So people may not know, but Das Williams now is the public relations person at the community energy, community choice organization here in the county. And maybe more will come from public awareness as a result of that. So I wonder if, because we're reaching the time we have to close, we always close at 1:30 our time. It would be good maybe for your team, Ben, to tell us quite specifically what you would hope that some of us would be doing to reaching out and making connection with what you are up to. I know you put, and by the way, you put so much in the chat. I hope people will save that material because there's a tremendous amount of resources there. So go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to recognize, there are people from Virginia and from Chicago and from Boston that I see here. And I'm going to guess that there are a lot of people who've been well behaved, and I can sort of feel that there's an energy here. So I recognize that there's a much more conversation that could be had. And I really appreciate the intervention there. Let me see here. That was from Irene about organizing a teach-in in November. And I think, whatever that you put together in Santa Barbara will be a step forward, and it will be a step forward in this process for Santa Barbara County, but also it will bring Santa Barbara County into better communication with people all over the world who are also organizing teach-ins. And I should tell you guys, that not only have we been out here, not just April and I, but there's about 7 of us who have been out engaging people at the Society for the Advancement of Socioeconomics in Montreal and talking with hundreds of people here. But there are also a number of people involved with the teach-ins from different parts of the world who are in Morocco right now, meeting with 5,000 sociologists from around the world, and they've reported that there's a lot of excitement there. So I think the number one thing clearly is to register at nextsystem.org to get on the list, so you get sort of follow-ups, to participate in the next online convergence that's going to take place September 4th and 5th. That's a Zoom gathering with lots of people from around the world, which will have a component that deals with the substance, some of the substantive issues we've been talking about. How do we do it? What can we learn? But also the practice, how do you organize a teach-in? So some training and so on. And then to organize a teach-in, I think that is the next step, that is most obvious to me. And I should also let you know that this next wave of teach-ins, we don't intend for them to be the last. We want there to be another round in April of 2027. So each step is another step forward in terms of building community locally and internationally. So that's what I have to say. I'll turn it to April at this point because I see you're off mute. And I just want to thank you all for everything you do every day.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I just wanted to lift up a quick point that, Dick, I appreciate you, highlighting how important the local is within the next system framework. But I also want to lift up that, this is the goal is to really, build that infrastructure beyond just sort of separate local iterations and expressions, even strengthening local ecosystems of all of these different kinds of, democratized work. So it is, looking toward the future, really exploring and leaning into, how do we develop more national systems of the next system, and then globally, right? So it's both and constantly leading into that gap.
Well, very good. So I would like to get the final word, just because.
Or could we, what about Matt and Joe?
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. I didn't know.
You got it. And then that's definitely the last word there for you.
Well, I might not get the time, which would be fine.
They'll be good.
No, I don't need it. Go ahead. Go. Quick. Who else wants to chime in? Joe?
Just very quickly, I put it in the chat. If you want to see what the Trump administration's up to week as a means of digesting this kind of flooding the zone strategy, sign up for trackingthecrisis.org. It's 1 email per week, Friday afternoons, into your email box. We read the news so you don't have to, so that you can keep doing all the good and important work that you need to be doing and not just be in reactive mode in the face of everything that's coming out of this administration. So free advertising, I had to grab it. Over to you, Matt.
Yeah, just quick. I do think that, it is unprecedented to have like sitting U.S. Supreme Court justices talk about a constitutional crisis. So there is a real opening there for the work we're doing and to, together build the next system. I'll also say that, it's going to take a level of urgency and tenacity and collective action. And I think that's also a spirit that we know so well locally. Just one funny example in my neighborhood is that a business closed down. It was like a gift shop and kind of a wellness center. And this local guy he set up his own thing right there. He sits there, he calls himself the local shaman, and just the level of tenacity that this guy had to step into a void, I think it is an example for us all.
All right. Well, thank you all. As Ben said, thank you all for what you are doing, all of us in Santa Barbara area and around the country who are a part of this call. Thank you to the team from Next Systems for all the work, all the creative thinking, and for taking the time to share with us. And the thing I wanted to say at the end, I can say with maybe one sentence. There's something strange about fighting to save a small local food co-op and resisting fascism in America. It seems unconnected. But the one way to think about it is what's happened in New York in the mayor's race, where very simple, straightforward proposals by a previously unknown candidate with a large army of supporters, proposals for free public transit, proposals for community-owned grocery stores in food desert neighborhoods, proposals for childcare and for housing, turned out the hugest number of votes of people who normally would not vote in an election like this. And it seems to me that what we need is regenerating understanding that our collective problems exist and can be solved collectively, and that can be happening through the electoral process, putting people in office who understand that. All of that is part of the process of resistance right now. At least that's how I feel. And I think to some extent, those of us who are working locally have that kind of thing in our minds. Anyway, thanks all. And thank you once again, Ben and team, for sharing and for bringing these messages to us. Save the chat. Don't forget, folks, as we say goodbye have a good weekend, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.